This hour is subjective value, or value in general. In the first hour, we talked about cost, particularly opportunity cost, and I put a whole series of statements up here on the board, and I'll repeat those for those who may have missed them. To be human is to be rational. That's something we talked about last night. To be human is to be rational. That doesn't mean we act rationally in a colloquial sense all the time, but it means we have a rational capacity. To be human is to be rational. To be rational is to have purposes. To have purposes is to plan. To plan is to arrange means and ends. To plan is to choose. To choose, and this is the crucial point, to choose is to forego. If you make a selection, if you make a choice from among alternatives, and there are always alternatives or substitutes, then you forego something. That is your next best opportunity. You give it up in order to select something. That is, to put it all another way, you cannot just choose something without not choosing something else. To make it as plain as I can, you cannot choose something without not choosing something else. That's involved in the definition of choice. We're looking at the implications, the logical implications of the definition of choice. And to choose is to select. So choosing always involves not choosing. Always. It means foregoing. And whatever you give up, your next best opportunity, your next best alternative, your next best substitute, is your cost. That's the cost of making that choice. I used the example of spending $20 on a shirt for Dad for Father's Day, when your next best opportunity might be a pizza party with your friends. And if you spend the $20 on the shirt, your cost of doing so is your pizza party with your friends. Also, every choice involves a cost, because that's the logical implication of the concept of choice. There's no such thing as a costless choice. Every choice, every decision, all of planning involves a choice. To choose is to forego. To forego is to incur a cost. Only actions or choices have costs. Things cost nothing. Things cost nothing. But acting or deciding or choosing always costs something. The costs are always borne by someone, that is, by some individual. I gave the example of the military draft. Sometimes people argue that we could save money, lower federal spending, balance the budget by drafting people into the Army rather than paying what it takes to induce them to join voluntarily. We can save 50% of our personnel cost for the military if we do that. Just rather than paying them $20,000 a year or whatever they get, give them $10,000 a year and draft them. For that matter, give them $5,000 a year and draft them. Save even more. But the cost hasn't disappeared. It's simply been shifted from the taxpayer to the draftee. The draftee presumably doesn't join the Army because he has a better opportunity. He's made another selection, another choice. He's chosen to work, perhaps. So he might be making $25,000 a year, and $20,000 a year isn't enough to induce him to join the Army. So he gets drafted, and now he's paid $10,000 a year. The cost has been shifted from the taxpayer to the draftee. It's now costing him $15,000 a year to work for Uncle Sam. That's what he lost between the salary of $25,000 and the draftee's salary of $10,000. Now, the costs do not simply disappear by the use of force. They're simply shifted to someone else. And in this case, you add injury to injury in drafting the man and then making him pay for it, making him lose $15,000 a year. And finally, costs don't determine prices. Prices determine cost. The values you place on things determine cost. Now, in this hour, we need to talk about value. And this became the central issue, the central problem of economic theory in the 19th century. This is the central issue, the central problem of economic theory in the 19th century. If you recall from one of my early lectures, I pointed out that Aristotle is by far the most influential economist of all time, and his teaching was that value is objective. Value is in the object. Value is objective. Some synonyms for that: value is intrinsic. Some people might use the word inherent in the object. All of these words, perhaps innate or fixed. All of these I'm using to summarize Aristotle's teaching, accepted for 2,000 years, about value, economic value. He said value is all these things. It's actually in the object. That's why we call it objective. Now, he drew a conclusion from this. Aristotle knew that people traded with one another. They exchanged things. They trade with one another. So he said, when they trade things of equal value. When people trade, they trade things of equal value. I listed this as Aristotle's idea of equality in exchange. He said if they do not trade things of equal value, then one of them is being cheated. One of the parties to the transaction is being cheated here, he said, if they don't trade things of equal value. Someone's being cheated. And you can see where now Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic philosopher, draws from this the idea of a just price. The just price, or the just wage, is the price of the wage at which the laborer or the seller or the buyer, no one is being cheated. The value is in the object, it's objective, it's fixed or stable, and you have to have equality in exchange. Now, apparently it never occurred to Aristotle to ask this question. If you're a party to an exchange, why would you go to all the trouble of making a trade or making an exchange if what you're getting is equal in value to what you're giving up? Why would you go to the trouble? If the item that you're purchasing is equal in value to what you're giving up, let's assume we're in a barter situation and you're trading a goat for a sheep. Aristotle would say those have to be of equal value, or one of you is being defrauded, one of you is being cheated. What's that? Yes. The gentleman says you would only trade if you valued or needed one more than the other. And by the way, in economics, we never use the word need. If I get around to explaining that, I'll try. But yes, in the back. Value is the importance you assign to something. We're not talking about, I'm not even using the idea of money yet. Yeah, you have two different items. Aristotle says the value of each is inherent in them, and they have to be equal. Or during an exchange, someone is being cheated. Equal to each other. Oh, you're getting ahead of things here. In Aristotle's theory, and this is the dominant theory for 2 millennia, the value is in the object, and it's fixed. The value is in the object, and it's fixed. This is Aristotle's theory. And the Catholic Church endorsed Aristotle's theory, and many people find it attractive. Because when you talk about subjective value, they think you're talking about subjectivism. And you're now free of all objective value. They think it has something to do with morality. But I've already warned you against that. We're not talking about morality here. We're not talking about ethics. Well, the comments that have been made indicate that no one would engage in trade. No one would engage in exchange. There's no sense to it. If what you're getting is equal in value to what you're giving up in exchange, why would you bother? Well, you're getting ahead of us now. Now you're talking about marginal utility. But that doesn't make any difference, because if you have one sheep or one goat or a whole herd of them or whatever, the value is in the object. You're making an assumption here that economists did not make for 2,000 years. On Aristotle's theory, no one would trade. No one would exchange. It would simply make no sense to give up what you have for something else if what you had was equal in value to something else, what you didn't have. Why would you bother doing it? Yes, sir. Okay. The suggestion is the other item is different. Does that make it more important, more valuable? It is something else, but why, if the value is the same as what you have, why would you bother trading? A different use. Yes, Aristotle said they did. Why not? If you're going to have a theory of objective value, then why couldn't two objects which are not the same have the same value?
I don't see how you can, because if you use the goat over the sheep, if you want the goat for breeding, then you had enough sheep, well, that changed your value.
But see, you're talking about subjective value. You have to stick with the theory here.
If Aristotle's right, if I won't trade 5 ounces of gold for 5 ounces of gold.
Well, in some cases you might do that even. You might do that. You might trade 5 ounces of gold for 5 ounces of gold in some cases. Because it's to your advantage to do so. Yes, in the back.
I remember when South Africa fell out of political favor, a lot of people were trading sugar rands for maple leaves.
Mm-hmm. Ounce per ounce. Yes.
Well, under Aristotle's method, how was determined what the objective value of the object was?
Well, that's a difficult question. And perhaps that's one of the problems with Aristotle's theory, how this objective value is determined. But nevertheless, he insisted that the value is in the object.
But he died poor.
There's a pragmatic argument. Yes, sir.
So people just accepted that and they thought, I'm not going to try to trade anything to better.
No, they didn't think that at all. Trade went on in spite of Aristotle. They did not let Aristotle's theory interfere with their trading. But Aristotle obviously didn't think about the logical implications of trading here. The only reason, given from all the things we've said so far, the only reason one would trade is to improve his situation. If we all act from our self-interest, our perceived self-interest, and every action incurs a cost, then the only reason anyone would engage in trade would be to increase their net worth, their net self-interest. Whatever they feel is going to benefit them the most, they will do. So they'll trade their Kruger rands for maple leaves, or they'll trade their sheep for their goats, but they do it precisely because what they're getting is worth more to them than what they're giving up. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. It's of greater value to them than what they're giving up. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. Have you ever heard the phrase, one man's trash is another man's treasure? Garage sales. Trash and treasure. There you have the idea of subjective value expressed very concisely. One man's trash is another man's treasure. And there it's very clear on subjective value. Where we used to live in New Mexico, it was an oil town. Oil wells all over the place, thousands of them. And when the market price for oil declined in the mid-1980s, the oil industry out there went bust. And oil rigs that had sold for $40,000 one day were worth $400 the next. You have a dramatic and rapid decline in the value of oil rigs because the price of oil changed. Now, if value is inherent or innate or fixed in the object, how does Aristotle account for something like that occurring? Nevertheless, it occurred. Now, in the 19th century, the economists, the three fellows I mentioned a couple of days ago now, I guess, Valra, Menger, and Jevons, the Englishman Jevons, came up with the idea simultaneously that value is subjective. They said value is not in the object, it's in the subject, and we are the subjects. This is the object, and I'm the subject. Value is in me. Value is subjective. It's not intrinsic. To use another group of words, I'll use the word ascribed, or imputed, or assigned. Value is in the mind of the individual. It's not in the object. Value is in the mind of the individual. I value something, you value something else. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Value is subjective. It's ascribed or assigned. If you have your Bible, let's turn to Mark 12 for an interesting account of subjective value. Mark 12, beginning with verse 35. Well, actually, let's start later than that. Verse 41. Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury, that he's in the temple, and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrans. So he called his disciples to him and said to them, Assuredly, I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. Now, if you're going to talk in terms of objective value, if you want to look at the amounts of money that were contributed to the treasury by the rich and by this poor widow, they may have given 100 or 1,000 times as much in terms of dollars and cents. But Jesus says she's given more. What's he talking about? He says, this poor widow has put in more than everyone else who has given to the treasury. What is the next best opportunity that this poor widow has given up in order to make this gift to the temple treasury? What's her cost of making this gift? Her livelihood. Everything. Her livelihood. That's her cost of making this gift. What is the cost of the rich in making a much larger monetary gift to the treasury? Maybe they had to forego a pretty robe to wear. It wasn't their livelihood. Their cost was much less. It was not their livelihood. Their cost was much less. Her cost was much greater. That makes her gift much greater. The value here is subjective. The value is not objective. And this woman gave a much greater gift than the rich, because the value is subjective. She gave up her livelihood. They may have given up an article of clothing. Yes?
Now, the value to her was subjective. Now, is the value the same to whoever's receiving it?
No, they have their own set of values. The recipient has a different set of values. And Christ is comparing not the recipient here, but the 2 donors. Those 2 donors have given up quite different things. Their costs are quite different. Their values are quite different. And if value were objective, Christ could never make a statement like this. This is one of the passages in Scripture They clearly imply that value is subjective. He says very clearly the poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury, and then he explains. And the explanation involves the theory of what we mentioned earlier, marginal utility. They put in out of their abundance, but she put in out of her poverty. Her next best opportunity, which she gave up in this gift, was her livelihood. They did not give that up. Now, one of the important implications of the subjective theory of value is that value is always fluctuating. Value is always fluctuating. And I'll illustrate that not by looking at prices in the market, which express values, but by trying to indicate to you what happens in your own mind. Let's say that you have gone without food for a week. You've gone without food for a week. Each passing day, food becomes a higher and higher priority to you. Perhaps right after you've eaten a good meal, it's a very low priority. You're not interested in eating anymore. You're full. You're satisfied. Normally, within a few hours, you begin to get hungry again and you eat more. What you have in your mind is a scale of priorities or a scale of values. And this scale is ranked first, second, third, fourth, and right after you've eaten, food is way down at the bottom. That's why some people will tell you, never go into a grocery store hungry. Eat a meal before you go to the grocery store. And then you will tend to buy less and buy only the things that you really need, rather than buying a whole bunch of things because you're hungry. So eat a meal before you go to the grocery store. After you eat, food tends to be at the bottom of your list of priorities, the bottom of your list of values. Maybe eating puts you to sleep. So you want to take a nap or go to bed after you've eaten a big meal. And your desire for sleep moves up your scale of priorities. Now, if you think about it and look into your own mind, each of us has priorities. What your priorities are, what rises to the top or near the top, determines how you behave. If one of your priorities is to learn more about Christianity, you read the Bible. If that is one of your priorities that falls way down on the scale or perhaps off the scale, you don't read the Bible. You never get around to it. If one of your priorities is to further the Christian gospel, you may make a gift or an offering to the church. If that's not your goal, it's not your aim, that's not your priority, that's not your value, you think it's a pretty silly thing to do, then you won't make a gift to the church. This scale of priorities is in constant fluctuation in our minds. Now, some things, I presume, depending on the individual, of course, but some things will always be near or tend to be near the top. And we'll talk about this idea a little bit later. Let's say one of your priorities is to be honest. You value honesty. You value honesty. So that may mean that since you value honesty so highly, that the desire or the value of food will never exceed that of honesty. If the value of food to you exceeds the value of being honest, what are you going to do? You're going to steal food. You're going to steal food. My wife and I had the experience a few years ago in Maryland of seeing this happen. Some young ladies, young women in their 20s were in the restaurant. When we came into the restaurant, we didn't pay much attention to them, but they were over at the next table. And they were served their food, and we then received ours, and we ate, and they got up and left, and we got up and left. And when we went up to the cash register to pay for our meals, the manager was talking to the cashier about this table of young women that had walked out without paying. They had come in, sat down, ordered their meal, eaten their meal, walked out without paying. And the manager was saying, well, this is the second time they've done this to me, but they're not going to get away with it again. Now, in their scale of values, eating a meal at a restaurant was of greater value than honesty. Eating a meal at a restaurant was of greater value than honesty in their set of priorities. So they walk out without paying. They didn't pay for the meal. Ordinarily, we would hope that in society, people would not put the importance or the value of food above that of honesty. Now, in Argentina, as we brought up the other night, Argentina is undergoing a famine. And there the Roman Church has said that looting in this situation is neither a crime nor a sin. They have, in fact, given their blessing, not just to stealing food, but apparently to other things, and said that's a greater priority, a greater value than honesty. Now, each of us has this set of priorities. Perhaps we don't pay much attention to it, and perhaps that's one of our problems. But each of us has a set of priorities. And some of the things in it, I've mentioned food and sleep, we hardly think about. We might think about them if we became very hungry and had to determine whether we valued being honest or whether we valued being obedient to God more than eating. In many churches, the people have a set of priorities that says the first thing up here is church growth. And perhaps down here a ways, we can have a proclamation of the gospel. But the first priority is church growth. And that means they rarely, if ever, get around to preaching the gospel, and they certainly don't do it if it interferes with their first priority. This scale of values, because it's subjective and because it's continually changing, determines how we act. It determines our behavior. And the values are in our minds. They're not in the objects. They're in our minds. Now let me ask you a question at this point. And it has to do with value and cost. Let's say, what's the ball team around here? The Seattle Mariners? Is that what everybody follows? What ball team do you follow? Mariners? Okay. What's a ticket to a Mariners game cost? A box seat? $100? Not much. Okay. Well, let's say somebody gives you a ticket to the Mariners game, and the face value of the ticket is $30. But the market value of the ticket, that is, you could sell it for $150. Let's assume they've started winning, Frank. And you could actually sell the ticket for $150. Face value is $30. That's what it says on it. Somebody gives you this ticket, though. What is it going to cost you to use that ticket and go to the game? What is your cost? You have been given the ticket as a gift. It says it's worth $30, but you could scalp it for $150. What will it cost you to go to the game? Well, it'd be $150. That's your next best opportunity. Selling that ticket for $150. But see, many people make the mistake of thinking, well, it's a free gift. It won't cost me anything to go to the game. But it will. By using that ticket, you're foregoing your next best opportunity. Yes, sir, in the back. Is Washington that backward? Is it against the law to scalp tickets? I don't know. Well, then you've got to decide whether honesty is a higher priority than ticket scalping. Then you've got a moral problem here. But do you see the subjective nature here and the idea of opportunity cost? The ticket says, objectively, it's worth $30. You have received it as a gift. But you could turn around and sell it for $100 or $150. So your cost, the opportunity that you forego here, is not zero. Let me ask you a related question here. Suppose the Mariners started giving away their tickets for the ball games. Would it cost them more to give 50 free tickets to an orphanage or 50 free tickets to college students? Okay, we have an answer. College students. Why? Okay. The answer is not that it would cost them the same. It wouldn't. In this case, it would cost them more to give the tickets to college students rather than to orphanages, the 50 free tickets. Why is that? Why would it cost the ball team, the Mariners, more to give them away to college students? Well, that's the answer I want. Let's leave tax considerations out of it. I'm not going to complicate things with tax deductions here. The college students might buy tickets. The orphans won't. Yes?
What happens if I buy a ticket, games in 2 weeks, I buy a ticket for $50, and then a week from now, Mariners get scared no one's going to show up, so they give away tickets. What did it cost?
What did it cost you?
It cost me $50.
Yeah. What you could have done with that $50. Yeah. No matter if they start giving away tickets in the future or not. That was your alternative when you made that choice.
But I lost $50 because now they bought the price of my ticket.
That is what economists call a sunk cost. There's no humor involved in this. But that's a cost that's been incurred in the past. Now, all of these things we've said here about planning and having purposes, they all pertain to the future. That's something that I didn't point out, but they all pertain to the future. Planning is always about the future. You never plan your past. Planning is always about the future. So a cost such as you mentioned here, that you've already bought your ticket, that's a sunk cost. It has nothing to do with planning. It has nothing to do with having purposes or arranging ends and means. And people get very confused on that point sometimes, especially businessmen. They think, well, I've already got so much money into this project, I've just got to keep it going. Rather than cutting their losses and saying, those costs are already behind me. What I have to do now is keep in mind the costs for the future. That is, my decisions that I'm going to be making from now on. Are there any other comments or questions about this idea of subjective value? It explains, among other things, why trade occurs. Aristotle's theory doesn't. In Aristotle's theory, you may be trading different things, but in his theory, those different things have the same value. Yes?
Well, I was just trying to think of different scriptures that would apply here, and if the words of Christ had been switched around, it would fit really nicely, but I'm wondering what he meant when he said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be. I mean, this seems to suggest that where your heart is, there will your treasure be. The one that's the subset of this.
Right.
Seems like it should be switched.
Well, what you value, that's your treasure. That's where your heart's going to be. What you value.
Right, and that's opposite of what Christ said.
No, that's exactly what he said.
He said that your treasure...
That's what you value. Whatever your treasure is.
So you're saying it's not the one is a subset of the other, they're just the same.
Does it mean treasure and what you value?
Yes.
Yes, they're one and the same.
What your heart values,
They're,
you'd use an equal sign instead of...
they're one and the same. The difference that he's drawing here is between those who place a value on worldly goods and those who place a value on heavenly goods. And if you place your value on heavenly goods, that will be your treasure, and that will be where your heart is. If you place the value on worldly goods, then you're always going to be thinking about the things of this world. And you will be consumed or obsessed or interested in the things of this world rather than the things of eternity. Yes, sir?
This might be a question, but did anybody care what Aristotle thought other than on? I mean, obviously people went around trading the way they wanted to do. What effect did his...
Well, that's a good question. What effect did Aristotle have on trade? And he had a tremendous effect. It didn't stop trade. People interfered with trade, or people continued trading, but it had a very great effect on interfering with it. In this way, number one, it stifled economic development for 2,000 years. One of his related ideas was interest-taking is immoral because money is barren. Yeah. And the Roman Church enforced this idea that interest-taking is immoral. They outlawed interest-taking, at least for Christians, and this explains the rise, for example, of the great Jewish banking houses in Europe, because the Catholic Church outlawed or forbade Christians from taking interest. Any Catholic could not take interest, so the Jews became the bankers. And this also explains a good deal of the origin of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism of the Roman Church and of later people was not always a racial thing, it was an economic thing. And if you read some of the anti-Semitic writings, they're denounced as blood-sucking capitalists. These are the blood-sucking bankers. And that sort of thing is all over the place. It's an anti-capitalist, it's an economic thing, this anti-Semitism. And it grew out of this teaching of Aristotle that interest-taking is immoral. It not only inhibited economic development, but it led to the phenomenon of banking becoming a province of the Jews, almost exclusively in Europe. And then, as a result of that, a great deal of anti-Semitic feeling. Yeah, Aristotle, ideas by themselves control the actions of men, but when an institution, such as the Roman Church, enforces them, they have a dramatic impact on society. Yes, sir?
In today's economy, cultures, say for example, some who are more socialistic minded within our country, although they cannot do it in a practical way, it doesn't work, is there a sense in which they try to bring the objectivity of an object, the value of it being objective, trying to force that into the subjective value? I guess what I mean is that when you see a lot of the way things get forced by government regulation or by people who are trying to get away from the capitalistic to more socialistic way of governing and doing commerce, that they want to look more at the equality of things, and so they're trying to force this creature into submission and make it objective rather than realizing the subjectivity of it?
Perhaps. I don't know. I haven't thought about it from that aspect, but perhaps there is something to that. That the socialists are really harking back to Aristotle's theory of value and trying to impose their objective values on everyone. Now, there's a good deal of confusion, and when I get to that subject, I don't know whether it's tomorrow